Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Susie Morse. I'm an assistant professor here at UT School of Law, and we'd like to welcome you to this afternoon panel on tax, inequality, and human rights. So, of course, as a tax person, I trust that when we bring inequality and human rights into the picture, it becomes so exciting that the last afternoon slot on a Friday afternoon will be nevertheless riveting, and it will be because these panelists are fantastic. So we're going to start with Magdalena Sepúlveda of the UN, and then Nico Lusiani, and then Dennis Davis. So let me introduce Magdalena first. She's a senior research associate at the UN Research Institute on Social Development. And I don't want to let you think that the program gives a full version of what she's going to talk about, because indeed she has some very broad things to say about human rights and tax and fiscal policy. Magdalena.
Thank you. I have to confess that I have changed my presentation, trying to address some of the concerns that I'm hearing during these 2 days. I have the impression that in that title, we are still struggling with what does inequality have to do with human rights. And now we're putting taxation. So what does tax has to do with human rights? It's still kind of an open question. So I'm going to start with the mea culpa. I think that historically, human rights professionals and advocates and human rights monitoring bodies have shown hesitation in addressing fiscal policies and their impact. Human rights advocates, we have said very little about taxation. This omission has marginalized the influence of human rights law in the fights against inequality. Thankfully, things have changed or are changing. Increasingly, human rights advocates, academics, NGOs, human rights monitoring bodies are using international human rights law to address the unfairness of some fiscal policies. And I'm going to try to give you a very personal example. From 2008 to 2014, I served as the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights. And in that capacity, I saw firsthand what were the disproportionate impact on the poor of some fiscal policies. For those of you who do not know, human rights special rapporteurs are human rights monitoring bodies assigned to an individual task. It's a very bizarre system. So human rights special rapporteur has to report back to the main human rights body of the UN, which is the Human Rights Council, on country visit and thematic topics. In several of my country visits, I address issues of taxation. One of the cases that I would like to give as an example now was on a mission to Paraguay. In Paraguay, in my official mission, the one that I reported back to the Human Rights Council, I found that the fact that in Paraguay there was no income tax and the government largely relied on sales tax revenues has a profound discriminatory impact on the poorest of the population. The poorest 10% of the population was paying 18% of their income in VAT, while for the richest 10% of the population, the impact of VAT represented 4.6% of their income. As well as breaching the principle or the right to non-discrimination by disproportionately cutting into their already small income, this also had a negative impact on their access to health, food, and other great standard of living. And what I wanted to stress here, and here I'm going to become very legalistic, is I said it was a breach of the principle of non-discrimination. And I want to stress that it's referred here, this is a legal standing, as the act or omission of Paraguay were not in conformity with the specific determinate conduct that it was required by international human rights treaties in terms of the compliance with the principle of non-discrimination, in this case, the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, but also with domestic constitutional principles that protected in Paraguay the principle of non-discrimination. So with this, I don't want to suggest that international human rights law prescribe precise taxation policies. It doesn't. Because each country has the discretion to develop the tax policies that they consider more appropriate for their circumstances. However, I would like to stress that international human rights law, those treaties that the state have voluntarily ratified and are compulsory for them, impose limitation in the discretion that the states have in the design and implementation of fiscal policies. But not only international treaties. So again, there are in several countries constitutional provisions or bills of rights limit the discretion of the states. And this is the tool that I wanted to stress. In the previous discussion, I think that David made a comment yesterday or this morning saying, why don't we use in a more radical way certain tools to achieve change? And I think precisely that international human rights law and domestic constitutional law, and in some cases domestic bills of rights, provide those tools that can be used to fight or combat inequality by looking for more fairness in fiscal policies. Again, I understand that I'm speaking here in an audience that in the U.S., in which economic, social, and cultural rights are sometimes not considered real rights. However, what I want is to stress that in several parts of the world, economic, social, and cultural rights are justiciable rights. They're protected in the constitutions, in their Bill of Rights, and there are legal mechanisms, there are writ of protections that you can bring to the courts or to the Constitutional Court or to the Supreme Court to protect those rights. And what I'm trying to say here, I started with this mea culpa, but my objective is that this trend that I see where I stand, that more international human rights NGO, like the Center for Economic and Social and Cultural Rights, where NICO works, or the work of academics as Radica that it's here, there is this trend. Now, increasingly, there are academics, NGOs, and domestic NGOs that are challenging fiscal policies with international and international human rights law and domestic bill of rights. Then, taxation, as I said, the international human rights law do not prescribe precise fiscal policies, limit the discretion of the state. Taxation, we have to understand, is a key tool not only to tackling inequality, but to generating the resources necessary for the realization of human rights. So, increasing tax revenue in a manner compatible with the principle of non-discrimination and equality enable states to invest in public goods such as education, legal aid, health services that are critical for the enjoyment of human rights. And not only that, we also have discussion yesterday and this morning that taxation can also be used to foster a strong social cohesion, governance, accountability, and participation. What I wanted to put forward here, and this is going to be my last word, is that if we want to promote and build a new consensus against inequality, of course, there is no silver bullet. There are several measures that can be taken, and human rights in law provide a tool for that. And one area, and this is the only time, I guess, for the moment, I'm going to go back to the title of my presentation, is that one area of reform that could be a good place to start will be to the reforming the rules and institutions governing the international corporate tax system. The existing system of taxing the global profits of multinational corporations is not only obsolete, but it's unfair. The current tax system enables systemic tax avoidance by large multinational corporations, depriving developed and developing states of critical resources to fight poverty and inequality. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Magdalena. So we have Nico Lusiani. He's the director of the Human Rights and Economic Policy Program at, of course, the Center for Economic and Social Rights. And I know that you had a number of strands in which you had tax and more generally fiscal policy that interacted with human rights, and I'm looking forward to hearing what you'll say about that.
Thanks very much, Susie. It's a real privilege to be here to be able to talk about these issues that are affecting all of our lives, some more than others. Magdalena, thank you for a good setting of the scene. I work with the Center for Economic and Social Rights, and one of the things we try and do is monitor economic and social policy for its compliance with domestic and international human rights obligations. We work with partners at the national level to audit tax and fiscal policies and develop, this is important, not just criticize, but also develop more human rights-oriented alternative policies. We also intervene in different regional and international processes, such as the Sustainable Development Goals process, FFD, Financing for Development process, and others, to help to challenge or reshape the systemic obstacles that our national partners are facing on the ground. And one of the biggest systemic obstacles happens to be the question of resources. In every country we go to, governments give the same refrain that there simply isn't enough money to meet even the minimum core of the right to health, right to education, other civil and political rights, access to justice, legal aid, free and fair elections, etc. And if you start to just scratch the surface a little bit, that claim that there is a resource scarcity is largely a perceived crisis, not a real one. And so what we've been trying to do is use the norms of human rights to interrogate whether governments' dismissal of resource availability is the case or not. So in that case, tax plays a very critical role. Let me just say four of the ways that tax policy affects human rights. The first is revenue, which Magdalena pointed out very clearly. We've been working in Spain in the context of austerity, and what we saw in Spain and in Europe was it wasn't just economic and social rights that were cut and undermined, but very real civil and political rights, which you would never imagine would be so undercut. Even the most basic freedoms, negative freedoms, such as freedom from torture, requires certain oversight mechanisms that need money to be able to protect those freedoms. So this idea that there's no relationship between revenue and civil and political rights or economic and social rights, I think, is false. In Spain, as an example of where revenue considerations hit hard on human rights, we know that there was a austerity package in 2011, 2012, and this was a reason for Spain cutting in health and social protection, gender violence programs that Radhika mentioned before. If you just look at, and we work with tax inspectors to do this, if you look at the amount of money in 1 year that could have been recouped in fighting tax evasion, according to EU standards, it would have been larger than all of the austerity cuts combined. So the need for austerity was not there, simply put. If human rights organizations and others had focused more on the revenue side. Moving to the second role of tax policies that affects human rights, tax policy redistributes burdens and benefits, as Magdalena was saying. This has economic effects on economic inequality. but also has effects on other horizontal inequalities. There are gender biases in almost every tax code, some of them explicit, but most of them implicit, which assumes a traditional role of a woman as a caretaker, and given gender pay gaps, disproportionately affects women. For example, having joint tax returns, or lowering top marginal personal income taxes affects men more than women. These are very real implicit biases in the in the tax code that redistributes economic gains. The third role of tax in human rights has to do with the concept of repricing, you may or may not have heard of. So sin taxes, for example, soda taxes or sugar taxes, tobacco taxes, pollution taxes, carbon taxes, the financial transaction tax, all of these have a role of changing behavior. It's not so much about raising revenue, but changing behavior in ways that protect public health, for example, that limit market volatility in the case of financial transaction tax. And a tax that Professor Galbraith mentioned before, having very high marginal income taxes at the top end of the spectrum is not really, does not really have a purpose of raising more revenue, but to change behavior so that that top end of the spectrum doesn't make as much, gives away more, or doesn't concentrate income at the very top. These are all examples that have very clear impacts on human rights. And then finally, the fourth R of taxation, representation and accountability. Governments that are indebted to their domestic tax base for its financing is a very different accountability relationship than governments that are relying on multinational companies or a small elite. So that's how tax affects human rights. How does human rights affect tax? The skeptics might come in and say, well, what does this all matter? We've been working with tax justice advocates from Oxfam, the Global Alliance on Tax Justice, and many others, tax experts, tax lawyers, and this is what they tell us. Okay, 3 ways that human rights is helping to support their work to build the tax justice movement. First, human rights provides a kind of a coordinating and mobilizing narrative that doesn't exist necessarily in the tax justice world. The idea of going to everyday people, mobilizing them around a financial transaction tax has its limitations. To mobilize around progressive taxation in many cases has its limitations. But mobilizing around the right to free higher education, for example, and then saying the instrument to get there is the financial transaction tax, that can work much better politically. The basic idea that public services are not privileges or charity, but are inherent rights of the governed with associated duties of public actors, that's a very important concept for the tax field that they are using. A second way that human rights makes a real difference in the tax field is normative. It can give content to justice. The tax justice field can and is using the content of human rights to base its advocacy. Let me give you a very clear example. Right to get information guarantees. One of the biggest limitations in tax justice is understanding both domestic and international fiscal data, and how some countries are benefiting on the backs of others, how some individuals within domestic spheres are benefiting on the backs of others. Using right to information guarantees can help get you there. It will get you a little bit more information that wouldn't be available otherwise. So procedural rights can be very useful in the tax justice field. Some have said that when talking about human rights and tax policy, let's just keep it to those procedural rights. Let's talk about transparency, information, participation, and leave it there. Let's not get into the substantive content of human rights as it affects tax policy. I think that's a recipe for inclusion without influence. If you go into a tax debate just demanding to be at the table without any clear substantive content of those policy recommendations, you're going to get nowhere, and you'll just be used as a human rights token to legitimize the policies that are already there. So the norms on economic and social rights are quite clear around the kind of the limitations of margin of discretion that human rights provides. I won't go into detail on some of them, on all of them, but maximum available resources principle sets out a requirement on governments to have sufficient financing for public services. Non-discrimination, as Magdalena mentioned, emphasizes substantive equality and not just formal equality, which is really quite important in the tax field. The non-retrogression principle has been very powerful in the field of austerity in saying that governments need to show and prove that their cuts had to happen and there weren't any other alternatives, such as raising taxes on different people or enforcing the tax code in a better way. Finally, international cooperation as a duty in international law, whether it's the UN Charter or the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, can recast this international debate around tax competition to one towards tax cooperation. And I think that can have some important impacts. And then finally, just to conclude, human rights can help enforce tax justice through the recurrence to different mechanisms, as has been mentioned before, whether those are domestic courts, as has been done in some cases. National human rights institutions and commissions have been starting to take a look at tax policy. At the regional level, the Council of Europe, their Human Rights Commissioner, has put forward guidelines on human rights, safeguarding human rights in times of economic crisis, showing that there are actually tax alternatives to austerity. The Inter-American system is now developing some interesting work there. And then all of the international system. And you might say, what's the point of going to the international system, to a UN treaty body, when the issues are not being implemented at home? And what I can tell you from the ground and working in various different countries is that there's a legitimacy associated with the UN that can really empower a local group that's trying to demand, let's say, reestablishing public health care access for irregular migrants in Spain. The fact that the UN Special Rapporteur, the UN Committee on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights, the European Committee on Social Rights has erred in their favor has really supported these groups domestically in giving their claims legitimacy and force that they wouldn't have had otherwise. And I think that's a very important currency in political debates to keep in mind. In the discussion, perhaps I can talk a little bit about the challenges. I'm probably overly optimistic. There are a lot of challenges, research and advocacy challenges I'd love to get into. I don't have the time now, but thanks very much.
Great. Thank you, Nico. I hope you can see the progression from the general to the somewhat more specific. And now we have Dennis Davis, who is a judge of the High Court of Cape Town and also the head of a committee in South Africa that is charged with recommending changes large and small to that country's tax system. So we have kind of an opportunity to now observe something even more granular that takes account of many of these issues. Dennis.
Thanks very much. Firstly, I want to thank Karen and Dan and Sarah and William. It's always lovely coming here, and thank you again. It's a fascinating conference. I'm not sure that I'm going to be particularly granular on a Friday afternoon. What I'd prefer to do is try to kind of give you some framework. One of the problems, I've now had the privilege of setting on 2 tax commissions, one as the deputy chair to the commission Mr. Mandela set up in 1994 to kind of power the ANC's economic policy. We sat for 4 years, and I've now been busy for 3 years as the head of the second National Tax Commission, which gives one a massive advantage of looking at tax systems across the world and talking to revenue authorities across the world. And perhaps the thing that really bothers me most about tax policy is the way in which it's hard to persuade ordinary citizens as to what is in their best advantage. You know, it reminds me, and if I can have 1 extra minute for the anecdote, it reminds me of the old socialist story about the society in which there's a minority of cats and a majority of mice. And in the first period of the country's rule, the white cats rule, and they order that the mice must actually have little weights attached to them so it's easier for the cats to catch the mice. They are then voted out and the black cats come in, and the black cats then insist that the mice have bells on them for the same particular purpose. Finally, the mice think, maybe that's not a good idea. Let's have a coalition of black cats and white cats. Well, of course, nothing ever changes. And then one mouse says one day, why don't we just get a mice government? And he was then locked up because he was a communist. and in a sense, you know, that's the troubling feature about much of tax policy, is the way in which it's difficult to persuade the citizenry as to an egalitarian vision that would actually work to their best advantage. Now, it is interesting to me that human rights has suddenly been sort of parachuted into the tax arena, and having kind of been involved on both sides of the fence, that is fascinating. And Philip Alston, in his recent report of the United Nations, says, quote, "It cannot be said, however, that current policies in the human rights area have come anywhere near recognizing the fact that tax policy is in many respects human rights policy. The regressive or progressive nature of a state's tax structure and the groups and purposes for which it gets exemptions or deductions shapes the allocation of income and assets across the population and thereby affects levels of inequality and human rights enjoyment." And I think Alston is making two fundamental points here. We have to be concerned about both the allocation and the collection. And they're absolutely crucial. They're inextricably linked. And of course, we have to be concerned, I suspect, we obviously have to be concerned with both vertical and horizontal inequality. And in relation to questions of vertical inequality, we shouldn't only be worried about the top end of the spectrum, but also the bottom end of the spectrum. And in a sense, both the taxation and the allocation come in there, as they should, in relation to horizontal inequality, not just the unequal distribution between men and women, but inequality between generations, which is going to become a more pressing problem as we move forward, with generations now having to pay the costs for environmental damage, for example, which this generation is obstinately not prepared to do. So the question therefore arises, well, what does tax have to do with this? Where does tax come in? And in the work that we've been doing, and we've been going for about 2.5 years, and some of what I'm going to talk to you about for a few minutes is based on a 100-page report. And if you actually Google the Davis Tax Committee, you can find it. There's a long report on the normative framework of taxation for a developing country, which I can hardly do justice to in the few minutes available to me. But I want to, in order to do that better, refer you to what I think is a magisterial text by Anthony Atkinson called Inequality. It's a better book than Piketty's, and it says an enormous amount, well, not that Piketty was not unimportant. Piketty, of course, was taught by Atkinson. But the point is, Atkinson's book is a very, very compulsory reading for anybody interested in this field. And what he says at the outset is this, that it should be stressed that the reduction of inequality is as much a matter for the minister responsible for science as for the minister responsible for social protection. It is much a matter for competition policy as for labour law reform. Inequality is embedded in our social structure, and the search for a significant reduction requires us to examine all aspects of our society. Why do I mention that? Because I don't think that either the taxation or the allocation sides really are a panacea for the problem we're talking about. They essentially give you a part of the way. They sort of prop you up on the basis that if you can then get a politics to reconfigure the structure, well, then we can start dealing seriously with both the horizontal and vertical components of inequality. But what do I then mean in relation to this, particularly with regard to tax policy? Well, let me make one final point from Atkinson's book, which is really interesting. What he asks is the question, how was it that there was a decline in inequality in post-war Europe? What happened there to cause this? And what he says is that there were underlying mechanisms, the expansion of the welfare state, financed by progressive income taxation. And as he quotes Marx, Nolan, and Oliveira, no advanced economy achieved a low level of inequality and or relative income poverty with a low level of social spending, regardless of how well that country performed in other dimensions that matter for poverty, notably employment. And so one really needs to go back and ask what was going on then, and how do we retrace our steps now in relation. That's his argument. So briefly, in relation to taxation, let me deal with that first. In relation to taxation, Atkinson and we to some extent agree. He makes a series of policy proposals. Number one, a significant increase in the marginal rate of income tax for the highest earned individuals. He goes up to 65%. And argues, by the way, that there's economic evidence to support the fact that that will not have these extraordinary consequences that a senator who apparently is located in this state and others seem to argue, and people in my own country, I might add. So now, that may not necessarily bring in all the income that you're talking about. You're dead right, but it does bring in some, which is not insignificant. But what it does do, it adds to the legitimacy of the system. You cannot have a tax system which basically grinds out the revenue from the poor without, in fact, taking account of the wealthy. We'll come back to them in a moment. The second thing is, he suggests, and rightly so, we should be looking at taxation of capital income, far higher than we do. That's investment income, dividend income. Wealthy people make their money not from income, from ordinary salaries like we do. I'm always stunned in South Africa when I look at the tax tables, of wealthy people, and I see people who earn more than, say, 3.5–4 million rand, which is only $3, I know, but by our standards, it's a lot of money. And I look at them and I think that they're only about 3,000. Now, I know more people at the Johannesburg bar, not the bar where people drink, but the advocates, who earn more than that. So why is that so? Because people earn through investment income and dividends, and those fall out of the system. Thirdly, capital taxes, which is what Piketty advanced. If you look at the statistics around the world, roughly speaking, capital taxes, like an estate duty, inheritance tax, brings in between 1% to 2% of tax take. It's true of this country, it's true of Britain, it's true of my country. We could actually, if you look back to the 1950s and 60s, get up to 9 or 10%. And it should be. Because if you go through the Piketty-Atkinson argument, it is inheritances that are reproducing levels of inequality unspoken of 20, 30 years ago. I know I've only got 2 minutes left, but let me try to do that in the time available to me. So there are a series of questions that we need to ask ourselves about the design of tax. There is more, I think, that we need to look at. For example, base erosion and profit shifting, just touched on by Nicholas. It's terribly important. The way in which multinational companies use tax havens to shift profits to low jurisdictions. This country is criminal in its activity because of the way you use controlled foreign corporations and your ability to allow your corporations here to essentially set up companies offshore, and therefore they don't have to bring the money in and be taxed on them, has created, to a large degree, the very industry which has utterly and completely demoralized those of us in the developing world. And may I add that this entire OECD base erosion and profit shifting initiative has, again, the ground rules thereof are totally skewed in favor of the developed world. And they should need to be redebated because, quite frankly, they're not advancing any of our interests in the developing world. But it's not only base erosion and profit shifting, nor is it only the Panama Papers. The Panama Papers are a tip of the iceberg. And the truth is, when we talk about real income tax at the wealthiest levels, enormous sums are located in tax havens across the world. Panama is not necessarily the only one. For my country, it's Mauritius. For other countries, it's the BVI, and so on and so forth. This is a huge area which requires far more attention. And, of course, the developed world does very little about it. We know the English Prime Minister, is caught with his pants down, proverbially, in this particular case. And why are we not surprised that nothing has happened? The Sub-Saharan Africa, the studies that we have available to us, 2 or 3, which I've interrogated fairly carefully, indicate that conservatively about $80 billion a year flow out of Sub-Saharan African countries into tax havens. If you take a simple proposition of a 20% rate of tax on that, what you get is 16 billion. 16 billion. If you take a country like my own, we essentially collect roughly 1.1, 1.2 trillion, which is under 100 billion US dollars. So you can see what the magnitude does to the second part, which is the allocation questions. How do we allocate the monies that we collect? Well, if you're not collecting enough, you can't really allocate sufficiently. So it's not just the design of the system, but also on the allocation. And I want to end, if I may, just with one point, which is to deal with the point made about human rights and tax design. It does seem to me that if we ask ourselves a fundamental question about fiscal policy, they're choices. Government makes choices. It is true that money is scarce, but the choices are made. There is nothing cast in stone as to how the money has to be spent. And the question that you've got to ask yourself is, what choices should we be making? Now, in countries, for example, that have thick constitutions with social and economic rights, there can be very little doubt that we, who, let's say, are a community thinking about all of these particular questions of inequality, might want to ponder, how is it possible to influence the budgetary processes around the world in such a way that the choices are made which are congruent with the commitments to social and economic rights? It's a radicalization, as you quite rightly say, but it seems to me that whole issue, both in relation to the distribution and the production of the economy, needs to be rethought in that way. And then one final snippet, it's this. In a country like mine, we now have, and we know this from a series of studies, we have the most successful tax and transfer system in the world, far superior to Brazil. How do I know that? Because we bring down the Gini coefficient by more than the Brazilians do. Ours came down from about 0.79 to 0.59. It's outrageous. The problem about that is twofold. One is, if you can't raise the funds, you can't carry on with the tax and transfer. And tax and transfers are only a palliative. All they do is keep people alive. And therefore, I'm afraid to say that taxation has an important but limited role. I come back to Atkinson's observation about structure, which we must always bear in mind in the context of this kind of debate. Thank you.
I want to ask the panelists if they have any questions for each other, and then we'll move to room questions. Don't worry, we have lots in reserve, so it's going to be exciting. Okay, to the audience then first. We're going to jump right into it. Who has a question? Oh, did you raise your hand? I'm sorry. Did you? Okay.
No, I think we're saying you agree.
We all agree.
Oh, you agree? Okay, good.
Enthusiastic points of agreement.
Okay. Yeah, oh, well. Yes.
So I would say, I guess, firstly, you can.
And, you know, I didn't do this when I asked a question earlier, I admit, but if you could introduce yourself again, that would be great.
Sure. Okay. Owen Taylor, currently based
Yes.
in London, SOAS. So I think you can and do have tax systems that grind money out of the poor and let the rich escape. That I would say would probably be most tax systems. And the Panama Papers reveal that, but you can kind of just know it anyway by looking at the systems as they function. So when Piketty describes his own tax sort of immediate palliatives to capitalism at the end, he describes that as a useful utopia. So I guess I'd like to push you a little bit on whether or not it's useful, because it doesn't seem particularly useful to me. I mean, unless you can find a way of dealing with the connection between state capture, states regulating and taxing in the interests of a particular group of people, and confronting that. Can you confront that through a tax system? Or that's just saying when the revolution comes and we've taken over the state, then we'll tax a little bit more fairly? Yeah, so I don't know if that helps.
Well, let me try to start. Owen, I think, firstly, what I try to argue, which is which is a theme that's come up over and over again at this conference, unsurprisingly so, is that the very ground rules upon which the entire world's tax system based are extraordinarily skewed in favour of developed countries and against developing countries. So, to be honest with you, I don't know where the revolution's going to come, but the truth is that there has to be some significant further political pressure to change those ground rules. I can go into all the technicalities. I'm not going to really at this time of the evening. If you want, I'll buy you a beer, and I'm more than happy to explain. But what I mean is that there are technicalities in the way in which, for example, there were big debates about a source-based principle or a residence-based principle for base erosion and profit shifting, and what was better. And what always inevitably comes out as better is for the developed world. That's number one. Secondly, I think it does matter, because I think what Piketty has shown quite luminously, and Atkinson as well, is that the ground legal rules, in this case of taxation, promote a process of greater inequality. You know, it's, as I say, it's not a revolutionary moment. I'm not suggesting that for a moment, but I am saying I think these things do matter. So if you take a country like my own, and we're not the only ones. I mean, many developing countries, same problem. The most efficient way to collect tax, by a long shot, if you didn't care about inequality, would be value-added tax. If I give you a simple illustration, we have a tax which is 14%. Right? That's the tax, value-added tax. If you increase it by 1%, we will actually collect an additional 20 billion rand. If we increase our maximum marginal rate for individuals from 42 to 45% for the highest earning individuals, we will only collect 5 billion rand. But the value-added tax is inherently retrogressive. So you've got to think through. What I'm trying to say is these rules, these way that taxation applies, is skewed, not just developing, but is skewed in order to promote both vertical and horizontal inequality. And I think those things do matter.
Yes, Nico.
One thing I just want to reinforce, as much as we work on tax policy and fiscal policy, because I do agree it's both sides, it has to be. If you look at some of the incidence analysis, there are countries where taxes are generally equalizing, but the transfers are unequalizing, much fewer benefits to the poor and more to the rich. And so the big scheme of things is that it's an unequal fiscal policy. Vice versa, you have tax policies that are very strongly unequalizing and could be made up by transfers. In Brazil, for example, Nora Lustig and others have shown that it's an experience of fiscal impoverishment. The poor are gaining in transfers, but the tax system drives them further into poverty. So tax and fiscal policy are really important, but that's the redistributive determinants of income inequality. There are the predistributive determinants of income inequality, the market rules that are set up, the labor markets, workers' rights and the ability to defend a minimum wage and collective bargaining. These are these set out the kind of the market rules which are that come before taxation. In a sense, we're putting a lot of burden on tax and fiscal policy for issues that were determined in the marketplace. And I think that's it's important to recognize this whole circle of the predistributive side and the redistributive side. Things like property rights, criminal and tort law, bankruptcy law. We talked about debt law and how that's done. There are so many legal determinants of income inequality that come in the setting of the market rules that are not inherent. They're particular choices. How do we define property, for example, is not a neutral process. For example, the property protection of bondholders in the Greek situation, the protection of that type of property is much different than the property of pension holders of public workers in Detroit, for example. One was protected, one was not. Those are political choices based on the law. That come before any of these tax questions. So as much as tax and fiscal policy is a central determinant of income inequality, and I think really important to human rights, there are these broader concerns.
To point. I think that I would like to again bring back the human rights. I think that one important discussion here is that fiscal policies have an enormous impact on redistribution. And we have, I mean, human rights can be used as a tool, the human rights discourse can be used as a tool to pressure for change. In Latin America, for example, a recent study of ECLAC, the Economic Commission for Latin America, said that direct income tax has a much higher impact in redistribution than social transfer, the cash transfer programs that are portrayed as the flagship of Latin America, and the Bolsa de Familia, they prosper in Brazil, prosper in Mexico. But actually, direct income tax would have a much better impact in redistribution. And again, so what I wanted to put forward is that we have to make taxation an issue that everybody cares. It cannot be dealt by expert. Everybody should have a say in what is the taxation system, because it has enormous impact in the enjoyment of rights. And in this argument, this utilitarian argument that human rights can be used to try to make a change, can also be used, in my view, to build a more inclusivity into the international tax cooperation, what you were saying, basically. That is the G20 OECD BEPS project is a step in the right direction. However, it is run by developed countries. The OECD has invited some 20-something countries, developing countries, to participate, but still have no voting rights and no right to change the action plan. So we need a system in which all countries can sit on the table to discuss international tax matter. There is another way of doing it. There is the UN Committee of Experts on Cooperation in Tax Matter, but again, this UN committee has no teeth, and there are proposals to put more money, more resources, and more competencies in this committee to try to address the issue. We cannot change the global tax system without cooperation among all the states, and everybody should be sitting on the table.
Thank you, Magdalena.
So the discussion of tax and transfer having to be thought about together made me wonder, is there a reason to be concerned about progressivity or regressivity in tax independent of transfer? That is, coming to the case of the value-added tax, is there a reason to be concerned about thinking about the tax system just by itself as opposed to just thinking about the tax and transfer systems together? Not just a pragmatic reason to be worried that maybe the transfers won't work as we think, but a more fundamental reason to think about there being some independent importance of progressive tax.
It's a very good question. I think if you take a very concrete example here in the U.S., maybe it's more a case of a political meaning to this. Bernie Sanders, as we all know, came out with a tax plan, and a tax and fiscal plan, which showed how he was going to pay for new right to universal education, right to health care, et cetera, et cetera. In the press and amongst some influential think tanks in D.C., they emphasized the tax side and said very clearly the middle class is going to get hit hard, and that means a lot in American electoral politics. Yet they didn't look at, maybe the way they're constituted, the tax policy center doesn't look on the other side. They didn't look at what would the middle class would gain through decreased health costs and various other reasons. And that helped to, I think, delegitimize Bernie Sanders' approach from a political perspective. And I think it's one particular example where looking just on the tax side and not on the spend side is an unfair approach and analysis.
And it's astonishing how people, do that. So I find it really interesting. Last year, one of the banes of my life of being the chair of this tax commission is I've got to sort of address all sorts of groups. And when the budget came out last year, I had to talked about 500 business people, all of whom were extraordinarily overweight. And I say this for a reason, because they were munching these vast breakfasts. And the speaker before me, who was a real kind of reactionary economist, got up and said, "What is in this budget for us?" In a country which, by the way, where you've got 35% unemployment and class and race are so overlaid, it's just so shocking. And of course, I got up and said, looking at all of you, it doesn't seem that you need very much. And the point about it is they're very resentful. There's a sense in which, not in my crack, they're resentful at this sense. You see, on one level, you're right. It's about what can you get so that the social wage therefore increases. But in developing countries, for people who really desperately need health care and education, the middle class who do, in a sense, are asked at some stages to bear a bigger burden, never see the fact that social stability is a massive advantage. They just, somehow, poor people just carry on starving and they won't moan. And there is a sense about developing a concept of community, which we failed ignominiously to be able to do. Can I just also make just one other point about, I also think that on the allocation side, one of the issues that we should be thinking about is efficiency of allocation. If you take, again, my own country, we spend an astounding percentage of our budget on education, far higher than any other African country. But if you look at the mathematics results of our children at school, they're far lower than almost all these other countries. And so it's not just a question of spending, it's also a question of assessing where the spending is going and how. And all of this should be part of that, because if you're talking about the right to education, it's not just vindicated by expenditure, it's vindicated by what in fact happens to that expenditure.
Maybe I could just interject a comment that just has been developed in my mind, which is that I think that at least some tax people are, believe it or not, modest. In the following sense, that if you have thought about tax policy for a while, you like to think about things with a budget constraint, meaning that you assume everything else is taken care of. Like all these decisions, the pre-distribution decisions that Nico mentioned, all the other decisions about actual public spending and transfers, you like to assume that somebody else does that. And you just worry about the tax and try to make that as fantastically efficient as possible. And so, I think about an example like FATCA, which is a reporting rule that not a lot of people like. On the other hand, it's the best cross-border individual anti-evasion tool that's been developed in recent memory and could be adopted by other countries. Not bad. And it's a very classic kind of tax wonks policy, just intended to make the income tax system a better one. I guess the only follow-up to that comment, and maybe people would like to react to it, is the thing doesn't have infinite computing power. In other words, if you take the tax system and all these different pieces of it, consumption, property, income, payroll, wherever you slot that in, and you say, oh, you have to take into account the whole of everything when you figure that out, people's minds will explode. They just can't do it. And as a result, it becomes so interstitial with lobbyists who want this or that at particular incremental places that perhaps it becomes even more vulnerable to capture. So I'd love to hear any reactions to that.
But FATCA is a really good idea.
I agree.
And I'm trying to desperately get FATCA introduced in South Africa.
Wonderful.
At the moment, because what it does is it forces banks to disclose who their clients are.
Very clever.
And if they're holding monies from foreign individuals, foreign corporations, and it concentrates the mind in the most extraordinary way. And I don't think we realize how much money is out there. So let me give you an illustration. The one thing I did get through this year in our budget, after shouting and screaming, and finally they accepted it, was we now have an amnesty, another one. So what we said to people was, we know you've got all this money out of the country, and if you come clean with us, you pay X, 25% of your capital, no further income tax to be paid, save going forward. And, and of course, the Treasury said to me, we won't get much money in. Now it turns out, our first estimate, bearing in mind that we collect a trillion rand, our first estimate was about 20 billion, which is pretty good for a country like ours. Now it's shot up to 40 because the pandemonium after Panama is such that everybody, but you see the problem that you've got to do in countries like ours, and right now, is you've also got to have institutions that work. Meaning, if you can't actually, the amnesties work if you can detect people thereafter and lock them up. And I'm a great believer in locking up. I think that a bit of incarceration of tax evaders is a jolly good thing. It concentrates the mind.
It does.
But it only does so if you've got an institution that works.
Very enough.
Ask a question along these lines, which is how radical do you think you have to be to succeed at this kind of a redistributive tax regime on a global scale? And in particular, it's a deep structural feature of liberal legal and economic orders that the protections, both procedural and substantive, that they give for private property are scale blind. So the carpenter's tools, our retirement accounts, and the hedge fund billionaires' portfolio all get the same rule of law process and institutional protections. And, of course, their relationship to the state are very, very different because the swollen fortune can hire sufficient expertise and talent to resist the state's effort to tax it in a way in which no one else's fortune can. And as a consequence of that, possibly, if you want a stylized fact about the taxation of capital over the last 50 years, it's that a competition between capital importing states and capital exporting states has been transformed into a competition between capital and all states, and capital is winning. And it's winning for reasons that are related to the scale blindness, and so to deep features of the liberal order. And it may be that if you really want to get at this capital and tax it, you have to get rid of some things like due process, rule of law-like values. I don't mean abandon them entirely. But, in the domestic tax shelter context, you have things like generalized anti-abuse provisions, substance over form, sham transaction doctrines, which are not really very rule of law-like doctrines in the ordinary sense of the tax code. They empower somebody to come in and exercise unreviewable judgment, to say, you owe. The last thing we've been talking about are things that can look a little bit like they're infringements on privacy of one sort or another, but might be justified by their revenue-raising characteristics. Do you think we need to go quite far in that direction, successfully to tax this kind of wealth?
It's a very good question. I just want to give you an example, which some are saying is beyond the scale of due process, but we think is very important in the international sphere. We know that particular countries have particular responsibilities for contributing to cross-border tax abuse, whether that's through base erosion, whether that's through trade, money laundering, et cetera, or offshoring of private wealth, such as we saw in the Panama Papers. Particular countries have particular responsibilities. Under international public law, there's a basic idea of transboundary harm. If one country harms the ability of another country to raise revenue, then some type of redress is necessary. I don't think it's very radical to say those countries which have more risk at undermining the tax base of another country should do an impact assessment. I think that's a pretty standard thing. Some have started. The Netherlands, for example, did a very interesting impact assessment looking at the spillover effects of its corporate tax policy in the developing world. Ireland did one, which was less impressive, methodologically flawed. But I think we need to start thinking about how we delineate respective responsibilities for those countries that are actually responsible for the problem. I point here to the U.S. for the reasons you mentioned, but also for the anonymous company protections that states like Delaware have. If we don't do, if all we're addressing these issues as a general problem, which require general solutions, this kind of mutual accountability that the UN likes to talk about is really mutual paralysis, because we're not actually holding particular governments to account for particular abuses. One of the ways we tried to do this is just last month we brought a submission with NYU School of Law and Tax Justice Network and the Berne Declaration. We brought a submission to the UN Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, where we made the claim that Switzerland's financial secrecy and tax rules undermine the ability of many developing countries to raise the revenue necessary to respect and protect women's rights and substantive equality. The CEDAW Commission members decided that this was going to be one of their list of issues. Okay, that might be interesting from a purely normative perspective. But what it means is Switzerland now has to go before a UN body to justify its financial secrecy policies and its impacts on women's rights. I think that's a step forward. I don't think it's a radical one, actually. I think it's pretty straightforward. The question is going to be in the details, and this is where the challenge is how do you develop methodologies for these spillover impact assessments that accurately assess the human rights impacts and gender impacts and equality impacts. That's what we're trying to develop ahead of the game right now.
Can I just...
I don't know if you make Magdalena perhaps something to add. Is that?
No, it was on the other topic, so you can continue.
Okay.
So
Oh, no, sorry. There's been some work done on the question as to whether a country breaches its commitments under the Convention for Social and Economic Rights if it allows itself to be a haven. Or because what it then does, it essentially reduces the possibility of other countries to raise the revenue to vindicate the rights. Some quite attractive work being done on that, and it's something that should be pursued far further. In relation to the point made about due process, let me say, I'm not sure, having been both a tax lawyer and now someone who's tried many tax cases as a judge, that in fact it's such a that in fact things like substance over form, or as some countries have a general GAR, general avoidance measure, is such a terrible abuse of due process. And I'll tell you why I say that. Because the gross ones are such. Certainly when I was a tax lawyer and advising clients, and you'd say, you're kidding. You know, that you can't be serious that you know, this is clearly something that's, and they'd smile and say, so you don't think we should go to court? Meaning, you know, a lot of people know where the line is, and the reason that they're able to exploit that is because of the lack of information. The biggest problem that revenue authorities are, having spoken to revenue authorities around the world, the biggest problem that they don't have enough information often to actually litigate these cases, and that becomes a big problem.
It's interesting that the GAR example is an interesting one. So I think people get worried about over-enforcement and violation of rule of law in that respect. My own view is that the Achilles heel of a GAR in a well-organized government anyway is the possibility of under-enforcement because so much discretion is left to the auditors. I think there's a question right here.
Yeah, thank you. I have to say I'm really enjoying this conversation. The one point I wanted to make is I think all of you have made it, is to not de-link the expenditure to the revenue. But one caution I have is that to assume that expenditure is mitigated by revenue alone is also a problem. To say that, you can only spend what you take in is a neoliberal idea of a balanced budget. And so I think you need to think about really fiscal policy. When can you borrow money? What are the kind of what discretion does the government have to make certain kinds of discretionary decisions about expenditure and also monetary policy? So when do you use the central bank in, the U.S., for example, has been lavish in its monetary policy in terms of quantitative easing, but it's not going to the places we need it to go to. So I think just by looking at just budgets and taxation alone, I think you're almost getting into an idea that there's a balanced budget. But what we need to look at is the discretionary ability to make macroeconomic policies that are progressive.
I want to see if Magdalena has something to throw in here.
No, I just want to go back to what Dennis says about the potential of the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. We have been arguing from 2013 that the interpretation that the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights needs to do regarding the obligation of international assistance and cooperation, Article 2 of the Covenant, is precisely that this obligation of international assistance, as Nico said, required refraining from interfering in tax policies in another country. So the idea is to open up, through Article 2 of the Covenant, the possibility to come in and tackle some of these extra boundaries issues, extraterritorial type of impact. Now, what I wanted to come back, I feel like the need of being the human rights person here and then try to see it. There are many challenges, as Nico said. I mean, we're not trying to be over-optimistic. There are many challenges, and one very critical one that the human rights movement has for many long is that it's dominated by lawyers. And we do need a more interdisciplinary approach to all these issues. So we're not expecting that tax expert will deal with everything or the human rights expert will deal about everything. What we need, I think that is that, in my view, and this is a self-criticism of the movement where I feel that I belong, the human rights one, but if the human rights practitioners and lawyers and advocates want to become relevant or continue to become relevant in this, let's say, post-2015 discussion, is that they need to start working in a more interdisciplinary manner, in which more links between it is happening. So there are good trends, more links between the tax justice network, economists and human rights lawyers. And it's very difficult. We all work in isolation, in silos, and we need to start working together in order to make the arguments. So again, it's not presenting the human rights arguments as the solution, as the silver bullet to deal with inequality or to deal with issues of taxation. But it's just one additional opportunity that had the advantage, many advantages, but I'm going to stress two. One, it is a political one, in the sense that the human rights discourse, it is a claim of universal values. We might agree, we might not agree, and we can challenge whether or not they're universal. But let's say that it's a claim, and that's this, and it helped. In several countries it helped. And on the other hand, it does provide a normative system that has very specific mechanism at the domestic and the international level. So it is an avenue that tax justice experts should not ignore. Yes. So we have to start working together. But that, I mean, it's easy to say, but it's a big challenge. And I also think that it's not only that human rights experts or advocates are going to win by working with tax justice network and trade unions and economists, etc. I think that, on the other hand, others also gain from the human rights approach. I think that economists are ill-equipped to articulate issues of unfairness and justice. So what we can do, I mean, the current concern of the extreme inequality that we live now, it's about injustice. And that is exactly what a human rights approach provides. The human rights lens, if you want, talk about asymmetries of powers and justice. So the human rights advocates can add that, can contribute in the debate in that sense.
Thank you. I think that, thank you very much. And the human rights framework, I think, is very useful for this discussion. I think it would be great to go back to the question about balanced budget and public debt, because I think that hasn't been answered, and let's try to engage it maybe also as well in the context of human rights that Magdalena has just framed.
So I'd like to answer that, because it's a really important question. And you did right. I mean, you know, it surprises me, because even an elementary grasping of Keynesian economics would say that if you run a deficit in circumstances where the deficit is caused by capital expenditure, you know, that actually is not fatal at all, to the contrary. Of course, it is true that if you run significant deficits on the consumption side, by shoving up, let's say, public service salaries to a large degree and crowding out funds and running big deficits which are unsustainable and getting into the sergeant trap, that may not be a great idea. But it also raises a further point. So, drawing back and just applying directly, it seems to me your point is utterly correct, and it therefore shows the extent to which the dominant kind of neoliberal economic discourse imprisons societies, even those which have unquestionably got a social democratic constitution, which makes it even more interesting. But can I just raise with you one other point in this regard, with your permission? And it's this. In developing countries, one of the banes of the life of developing countries are the rating agencies. And I don't think that's been spoken about, and I can't emphasize it strongly enough. So just for illustration, what I mean by that is you've got these things like Standard & Poor's, and they come into your country, and then they say, oh, you know, your economy is really kind of going down the toilet, your politics are terrible, and we're now downgrading you to sub-investment grade. And then 6 months later they come back and say, you junk status. Now if you take and I know this well from my own country, if you take the illustration of what it does for a country like South Africa, we're really close to junk status at the moment, which would be disastrous. Simply being downgraded junk status on the borrowings that we've made, much of which is for capital expenditure, I might add, we will add probably, we already spend 110 billion, which is roughly 10% of our tax take on interest costs. It will double. So what it does is it crowds out other expenditure, puts you in and then you can't get further monies on the capital markets in order to fund your... So these rating agencies, unaccountable, whole bunch of, people who sort of, 3 years old who arrive in your country thinking they know everything, and they then produce a report, and the next thing, you've doubled your interest costs, is a disaster. And that's part, a kind of almost anarchic part of international governance, which is absolutely central to every developing country in this world.
So an exogenous market force that puts a cap on public debt, even if human rights would like to demand otherwise. Nico.
If I could just make a simple point that it's not just in developing countries.
I know.
The economic crisis in Greece and Spain was very clear the role of the
Some people might say they're developing countries.
And, well, the United States also, if you look back at the Clinton age, there were some very clear things that came out later that said Clinton was listening to the credit rating agencies more than any other force in the economy.
That's shocking.
I had a conversation with the lead U.S. economist of Standard & Poor's, the person that wrote this very interesting empirical analysis about how inequality hurts economic growth in the United States. And I said, if that's the case, then why don't you start grading countries on how well they're tackling inequality, in addition to the economic indicators? And how could you do that? Well, let's look at whether they're investing in the things that fight economic inequality: health, education, social protection. And she said, I never thought about it. I don't really talk with the raters. I just do the economic analysis.
It's truly because the financiers also are modest and are only able to think about credit risk.
Yeah.
Anything else from Magdalena? Okay, great.
Yeah, I also want to talk about developed countries because and go into just how powerful the interests at stake in this kind of thing are and how almost ruthless the collaboration can be between, different capitalist elites. And I'm following up on something that was that I said in this thing about healthcare. In Texas, the neoliberal agenda for universities is you run them like a business, and you don't use taxes, state taxes and everything. You keep cutting the amount that's spent on higher education. So to do this medical school at this university, in order to get the funding, they did it through local taxes, which is strictly property taxes. At the state level, you have a regressive tax, a sales tax. We don't have an income tax here, but then there's margin tax. There's oil and gas extraction tax. There's all sorts of other taxes that you can spread this thing around. But you pushed it all down to the local level, and the jurisdiction at the local level is really just taxation for healthcare services, but you're taking a huge chunk of that money and applying it to a research platform that investors are going to come in and they're going to commercialize the research. So the poor people get screwed at a local level in terms of the healthcare level of healthcare services, and then you've really juiced up the tax rate here. So then your gentrification issues are exacerbated, and this is basically because they wanted this. They wanted a research platform that could be commercialized. And there is not, what is problematic for me in dealing with this, and I have tried to deal with it, is it doesn't, I mean, human rights, really. I mean, they don't give a damn. You can't say anything powerful enough to reverse this thing. That's how strong these interests are. At a local level that are pushing down in this particular kind of industry in this constellation of power. You know, how do you deal with that? This is a developed country. This is the way they treat the undeveloped population in a developed country. So how do you change this?
The panel may be just simply taking that on board. It's a challenging thing.
I mean, just to say that's a question of political mobilizing, and I think that human rights could help in that. If you look at the U.S. Human Rights Network we've talked about, I don't know if there are any members in Texas, but it seems to me that tax and fiscal policy is one issue that affects almost every group. Sectoral group. If you're working on health, if you're working on education, if you're working on gender equality, even if you're working on the death penalty, somehow resources affect all of those things. And so, to me, the focus on tax and fiscal policy is not only important on its own grounds, but it's important because it can bring together different sectoral interests that are all fighting for public interest reasons. Perhaps even in coalition with some government agencies that want to raise more revenue for a more productive aim. It's I don't know the politics in Texas, so I can't opine on that. But many places in the world, I'd say, human rights understandings amongst local people are much more advanced than here in the United States. And I think actually the U.S. has a lot of learning to do from places in Latin America, South Africa, about using human rights as a mobilizing force. I mean, you have going back to FDR, an Economic Bill of Rights. Martin Luther King had a Poor People's Campaign. These things exist in the U.S., but they're sporadic, perhaps, and they haven't been brought to light as much as they could be.
The idea of political mobilization is very compelling in this area, and I still kind of can't put all the pieces together for the following reason, that if you imagine political mobilization that makes something happen, has whatever sort of tax system you want, it's still set up right now so that then it goes to the tax administrator to be the expert to implement it. And let's just stipulate that the tax expert doesn't have the computing power to do all this. So then what? And let me put something on the table. I would love to hear your reaction to it. In the United States, and I believe in most other countries, there's no taxpayer standing, by which I mean, although if a particular individual has an issue with their tax bill, they want to fight with the government, they can have at it. But it's not allowed for anybody else to say, hey, government, you're being too kind to that corporation, or too kind of, you're captured by this group of individuals, or what have you. Does that something that comes up, and would that be something that you would support as a possible instrument of human rights influence in the fiscal system?
It's a tough question. I was at a conference on taxpayer rights in D.C. a couple months ago. It's an international conference, but focused a lot on the U.S. And there was a very interesting conversation about how the fact that a multinational has a very large tax exemption or tax expenditure benefiting them, if you can make the case that that raises the burden on individual taxpayers, then they would have a right then to defend themselves against the tax administration.
That's just the question. That's correct, yes.
And there were some interesting tax authorities which are implementers. They're not policymakers, but they're still trying to get into these issues for a number of reasons. I mean, a very pragmatic reason. You can't get enough revenue out of a society that has no tax morality. A society that doesn't believe in the tax system is not going to contribute to it.
Well, I mean, there's withholding.
Sure. In systems that have formal tax systems. But all I mean to say is that there's a reason for tax implementers and administrators to care about where the money's spent, because it's going to affect how much they're going to be able to raise, how good they're going to be able to be at their job.
I appreciate that, but I feel like that doesn't take the premise. Like, the premise is tax administrators can't think about that. They don't have the kind of bandwidth to do that. Right?
No, they don't, and they concentrate. I mean, you've got a taxpayer's bill of rights of some sort, which oddly enough is a lot more extensive than in many other countries, with your taxpayer advocate and that's that. But you did right. I mean, if you're taking what I think you're asking is the question: if a large multinational corporation gets off scot-free,
Yes.
right? Well, what then? And that would depend then, firstly, on the country's rules with regard to standing.
Correct.
I.e., who would have locus standi to bring such a case, and what would their cause of action be?
Correct.
Now, I think in some countries, including my own one, I think it is possible to bring such a case, because we've got very, very wide rules of standing, constitutionally entrenched, meaning that you can bring a matter in the public interest. So standing isn't the problem. The problem would then be, what would your cause of action be? And if your cause of action perhaps would be equality, meaning that this person has not been treated, or alternatively a more creative argument around the socio-economic rights, it's possible.
Yeah. Even something mundane, that this regulation
I know that would, for an American audience, that sounds absolutely crazy. But in a number of countries, where standing rules are much more relaxed, the possibilities are there.
That's good to know.
Let me come in that. I think that what is the previous step of that is to raise awareness of the impact of this tax evasion. Recent studies now of ECLAC shows that tax evasion in personal income tax and corporate taxation represent the equivalent of 4% of the GDP of the region. So this is a commensurable number. What does imply lack of investment in public services, health, education, transportation, you name it. So, and that is where we need this collaboration.
Yes.
We need, in order to get there, we need to raise awareness that these are the numbers, and this is something that everybody should be appalled. And this is something that we need to talk and to discuss. The numbers that Nico mentioned regarding, and that's why it's not only developing countries, but also developed countries, austerity measures in Europe. I mean, if we put the numbers in terms of the budget cuts and the numbers of tax evasion, then this mobilize people, or should mobilize people. And this is what we need to do. And that is why the collaboration is necessary in order to build this type of cases and just have fairness in the tax system.
So it goes back to an earlier question, which is to what extent you can develop a jurisprudence around exchange of information that actually works.
That's correct, yeah.
Because if you've got that,
Yes.
and it is true that for developed countries, I mean, the one thing I've begun to notice in my conversations with revenue authorities in the developed countries is an increasing interest in better forms of exchange of information, because they're under pressure too. And if you get that, that indeed then unlocks much of what you're talking about. It is precisely because of the lack of information that tax havens of the kind that we've just seen in Panama exist. Not because of any creative lawyering, it's basically straight non-disclosure of a particular kind, and the rest of it's actually very crude.
Let me
you
just
have one more
compliment
question. Yeah.
there.
sorry.
It's just, I think that working on advocating for transparency in terms of multinational corporation country-by-country report,
yes.
trying to, in terms of extractive companies, going for advocating for project by project in the countries. What we need is a disclosure of information, and that, again, in a very utilitarian terms, all what we have learned about access to information campaign, access to justice, disclosure campaigns, we need to use it in order to put even this other form of mobilizing that is leaking information. I think that they're going to prove to be much more effective. The leak of the Panama Papers are going to, I hope, they're going to have an enormous impact on all these issues.
Some countries, by the way, have unilaterally already introduced country-by-country reporting. Australia is a good example of that. So they're insisting on multinational corporations that trade in Australia have to report on all of their linkages right across the world if they're into Australia.
I think it's
that
passed
makes
into
a
law
lot of
now,
a difference.
as well.
Yeah. Just one quick point, sorry. But
I told you it would
if
be
you looked
lively.
at Swiss Leaks and followed that story, or the LuxLeaks story, now Panama Papers, who is the real people that suffer? It's the whistleblowers. They're the ones that are being
They get
threatened with
fired.
jail time. Yeah. We don't know who the Panama Papers leaker was, but you better be sure that someone's going to find out, and he or she is going to be the brunt of a lot of punishment and stigma. So some of us have been starting to think about how can we use the idea of prisoners of conscience as and use that type of analysis, which is quite extensive under international law, use that to extend to tax justice whistleblowers.
There's been a question in the audience that's been out there for quite a while. I'd like to take it, and perhaps we'll keep any comments very brief. Thank you.
No, it's not a question, it's a comment.
Lovely.
I think that this discussion shows what Magdalena was stressing, the need of more cooperation between human rights lawyers and tax lawyers and economists, because you asked the question if there is a kind of standing against, for instance, exemptions of tax policy, because usually all tax law is made in the benefit of the taxpayer. But if you use human rights instruments, you can build another argument. For instance, states, according to the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, has to make all the efforts to realize economic, social, and cultural rights according to the maximum available resources. So if you can show that the state is not making enough effort to collect available resources, the state is violating the covenant. And you can build an argument. It's a difficult argument, and that's why cooperation is between different sectors of law and economists and political scientists is crucial. If you don't make it, the corporation has this collaboration. They have good tax lawyers, they have good economists, and they can build strong arguments. We have to make the other arguments on the other side, yes. And I think that we can do it. Monitoring bodies are making strong arguments against states when they don't collect enough taxes. They said, why do you say that you cannot fulfill economic, social, and cultural rights, and you are saying that you don't have resources when you have all these exemptions? Yep. You are violating the covenant, and you can build this kind of arguments. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the comment. I hope we've made some progress on building some of those arguments today. So thank you to the panelists, and thank you all for being here. Thank you very much.